to this week's IG Live. Just a little programming note, we are not having an IG Live next week. And when we return the following week, it's actually going to be on a Wednesday. So just keep an eye out for those announcements. And after that, we'll resume our usual Thursdays at 2 o'clock Eastern. But today I am really excited because I'm going to be talking to Gabriella Aldeman, or Gabby. And you may know her. She's the author of Paula's Patches. And she also just had a Squawk of Spanish come out, which is also available in Spanish. And so we're going to be talking to her about her books and about the importance of representation. And again, we do this every Thursday, 2 o'clock Eastern, except as I mentioned, sometimes when we have to modify the schedule. You can find all of them on Instagram and on our YouTube channel. Hello.
Hi, how are you? I'm so
Good.
glad to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's so great to talk with you. And why don't we go ahead and get started, and you can tell us what was your journey to becoming an author?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to share. Actually, it was through translation. So I'm also an English to Spanish translator of children's books and for nonprofits. And I've always loved to read. I've always had a passion for the written word. And I wrote for myself. So I would write journals in my journal, in my diary. I would write poetry. But I never thought I could become an author of books, like an author. That to me was someone high up in a pedestal, the true masters of the English language. And I guess not for someone who English was their second language. So it was my hobby, but I was a translator and I really wanted to translate a children's book. That was the goal. That was my dream. And I did find a space and time. I made some time to make this happen. So what I did was I joined SCBWI, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, who's also for translators. So I joined to learn about the industry. And I did. I learned about the industry and I fell in love with the craft. And as I fell in love with the craft, I started writing my own stories. And that to me, it was just so amazing. I just found this medium that I loved. And I remember telling my husband, my family, like, this is it. I can be a writer, but I thought of myself more of a practice. Like this would be my practice, writing these stories. So I joined critique groups, I joined writer groups, but the idea was always that this was going to be a practice for myself. But it was this community that really kind of pushed me. And it was the writing community that said, you should try. You should try to publish. You should try to pursue this. And I guess little by little, that's how I got here. And this is a good question. And I like to remind myself of it because of that, I don't know, like that passion, that like love that I had for the art, because so much of publishing is out of our control. Right. So I like to remind myself of this because, I don't know where I'm going to be publishing wise 20 years from now, but I would like to think that I would always be writing.
Yeah. Oh, that's so lovely. And something that's interesting is I know you've said that because there is not great representation in children's books, that for a long time you didn't think that was part of why you never thought of yourself as being an author, didn't think that your stories were really worth publishing. Why is it so important for kids to be able to see that authors come from all different backgrounds?
Yeah, it is true. It's very important to see that. And I go to school visits and I introduce myself to the kids and these young readers, and I tell them that I always love to read and I always love to write. And those are two things that you need to be an author. Like, you need to love to read, you need to love to write, but that something was missing. And I asked them, what do you think was missing? And they'll tell me, and they're like, oh, you were missing a computer, or and then you get like the really savvy ones that would say like, you need to invest in your future. You're like, all right. But yeah, but then what I tell them is, well, the big thing that I was missing is I didn't believe in myself. Like I didn't believe I could, right? And yeah, like I said before, I read a lot in English, I read a lot in Spanish, but I think I was missing this in between stories. And when I go there, the main thing is like, I want you to see me. I'm an author, and I'm also your neighbor, and I'm the mom of your friends, and I am bilingual, and I am an immigrant. And I just want them to realize that authors come in all different shapes and sizes and skin colors and religions, and that if they really, love writing and love reading and love storytelling, if they want, they also could be writers or authors of different things. So yeah, I think a lot of it is that representation of just seeing someone else that has done it. It kind of gives you permission. It kind of gives you room to do it yourself.
Which ties into something that I know you said. You said that you write to make children become readers and for all readers to feel seen. So you talked about how it's important for kids to think of themselves as storytellers, but also you make this connection between seeing yourself in books and falling in love with reading in the first place. What is that connection there?
Yeah, I think I love books. I think they're magical. I think no matter what, you can fall in love with reading, you can fall in love with books. I think reading a story that is far removed from your own experience is a beautiful thing. It gives us more empathy, more kindness, because you are putting yourself in someone else's shoes. When I was a kid, the stories that I loved I loved the Babysitter Club series, which I know is so popular. And I found a lot of it relatable because they were my age, but it was a lot like a friend telling you their story. So I was able to get into their world, and it was a friend. I was in a friend's world, but as soon as I shot that book, it was a story that was far removed from my own, and it wasn't until age 36, which is crazy, and I know 100% that there were lots of books out there before I was 36. But for me, it was that age. I was 36 years old when I read my first book with a main character that was a Latina living in the U.S. And about her own family. It was 36. The main character was 12.
What was the book? Do you
And
remember?
yes, it is another half of Happy by Rebecca Balcarcel. It's a middle grade, and the main character is Guatemalan-American. And it's so funny because of her point of view. And I remember feeling she was very relatable, and her mom was very relatable. It's kind of in between the two. But I laughed. I was reading out loud to my husband parts of it because I felt like if I did, he would understand me better. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think it goes to this other level, right? So even us who love books and we love to read any book, when you feel understood and seen, which are two things that are so important to feel throughout your life, I think it just reaches another level, and it can really make you a reader for life. So
Right.
yeah, it's just a beautiful thing to experience.
Well, and speaking of representation, so I want to talk about your books. You have Paula Patches came out last year, and Squawk of Spanish, which is also available in Spanish, just came out. In some ways, they're really different books. I mean, one is talking about a little boy and his trying to communicate with his grandmother, and the other one is talking about a girl who's kind of embarrassed because she gets a hole in her clothes, and kind of realizing that everybody else has these kind of problems too. But one common thread is really teaching kids they don't have to be perfect. It's okay to have mistakes, okay to have things go wrong. Why is that so important? What do you hope kids take away from your books?
Yeah, this is something that's really interesting because I definitely don't set out to teach anything, but I'm processing as I go. And I guess this is something that's really important to process for myself, to understand, to learn it, to teach myself, I guess, and see where my values are. And I guess with both of these books, you're right. Paula's patches, she starts with tearing her clothes. And at the end of the book, her clothes are not magically better. The story arc is more that she feels more empowered, I guess. That's the end of the book. She makes a patch for herself and for everyone. But what she really needed, she always had this creativity, this creative energy to be resilient and to solve problems. But what she needed to tap into that was to be embraced, was to feel like she wasn't the only one that was going through this. And that's kind of like the story arc. And with Max, in Squawk of Spanish, he can't roll his R's. He has an accent. His cousins tease him.
Oh, the cousins, of course.
Cousins. But at the end of the book, the cousins are still there, right? And his R's still don't roll. And his words still get stuck in his throat. But the story arc there is that he finds the courage to try. And his relationship with his grandma just flourishes. There's just already a very strong relationship. But then now he's there. They have this beautiful relationship of he's trying. He's trying to, he goes on this language acquisition journey with her. And we also see Abuela trying a little bit of English. So it's this, I think for me, it's just so important to end books like this because perfection, you know, what is that? It doesn't exist. No one can reach it. And I think that what I think is that embracing imperfection is really that first step towards courage, towards like really having the courage to whatever that is, to be creative, to be yourself, to put yourself out there, to try to learn. And sometimes we have to learn things that we want to, or we want to practice things because we want to, but we don't know if we're going to be good at it. We don't know if it's going to end in something. And it could be very vulnerable experience. Having that courage is putting the effort and having the courage to practice, to be ourselves, to push ourselves. That's the hard part. And that's the part that I always feel like should be celebrated. And I think embracing imperfection is the first step to then leading with courage.
Yeah, and you really see that in both of them. Like you said, I mean, the endings, things aren't perfect, and yet the kids, you can just see the change in their faces. They feel so much more confident. They feel so kind of much better in their skin, you know, that they've taken that step. And I think are surprised at how other people react. That his grandmother is so excited that he's talking. She doesn't care that he can't roll his R's. Or for Paula, that all of her friends want the patches too. Like she was so nervous, like would they want it? Would they think she was weird? And yet they loved it too. And Squawk of Spanish, I think is so cool because there's so many kids who are in this kind of position. I think about my own kids with their grandparents and the language barrier and so many scenes just like this. So it's so relatable. And I want to talk about, I mean, you know, your handle on a lot of your social media is right between, and you talk about kind of growing up between two languages. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about how your books kind of help normalize bilingualism, however that may look, you know, like in Max's case, it doesn't mean he speaks the language perfectly, but having that kind of interplay of languages.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it all goes back to representation and positive representation. And in Paula's Patches, I actually didn't use Spanish throughout. It's not a book about language or culture, but like you said, in Squawk of Spanish, Max is bilingual. It just happens to be that his strong language is English, and then his heritage language, the language of his grandmother, is Spanish, and it's the one that he does not feel confident at all. And I think, especially in the US, there is such a different range of what it means to be bilingual. And sometimes even within one family, within one household, you see that. In Max and his cousins who have the same grandma, but the cousins are just perfectly bilingual. So yeah, we see that. And sometimes we see that even with kids. I have two kids, and my oldest is more proficient in Spanish because I stayed with her at home when she was little and spoke only Spanish. And then by the time her brother came along, she was in school and came back speaking in English, and it kind of ruined my my project. But yes, there's such a big range in bilingualism. And and then others, they are in this language acquisition process, and the struggle there is whether they have an accent or whether they, and so much of language is tied to a person's identity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of it is representation, and I think a lot of it is just celebrating it, like celebrating that you're in the language acquisition process, in this journey, like just we all learn. And representation, I think, is important because of the tie to a person's identity. Again, I think some people just feel like, okay, I have the name, I have the looks, I have the parents, so why can't I? My cousins speak perfectly.
Right.
So just that representation, because there's a lot more of us than is represented in books, right? So there's just this really long, really big range, and it only takes like that permission, like be where you're at, and you can only get better, right? And being bilingual should be a great thing. It's learning two languages instead of one. So
especially like we see in this book, I mean, it allows him to have this really beautiful relationship with his grandmother, even if they can't communicate perfectly. Now they can bake together. Now they can be together. Even if nobody else is around to translate, they can communicate enough that they can have this special time together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for Max is also this, like, I think the end of that book, for instance, is like, and my cousins, and then it's just like, it's a funny end, but the thing is, like, it doesn't matter. Like, they don't matter. Like, why are you asking about my cousins? And my cousins, yeah, and then sometimes they don't say a word.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, that happens a lot with kids too. Like, they can be, they can kid around, and sometimes they can be worse than kidding around. But when it's about you just like suffer it and internalize a lot more than they like move on to something else.
Right.
That
Right.
that I guess that's just part of growing up. That happened to me a lot.
Right.
Once you decide for yourself that it's like, it's fine, I'm fine with it, I forgive myself, then who's gonna say?
So it's not a big, you see that it's not as big a deal as you thought it was, which I think kind of shows up in both of your books, that things are, like that said, like with Paula also, is something that she thought was just so terrible, having a rip in her pants, and then it turned out it wasn't that big a deal.
Yeah.
And her friends weren't, nobody made fun of her, like she thought was going to happen. But to go back again about the Spanish, I was interested because I understand that you did the translation for your own book. So I'd love to talk a little bit about your experience as a translator and how that kind of, I mean, you talked about starting off with translation and then becoming an author, but I wonder how those kind of influence each other when you're translating somebody else's book, especially because you've talked about being a bicultural translator, that is not just translating the words, but you have to kind of understand the context. So how does that work?
Yeah, I just have such, I just love books so much. I think I love when they're translated, and I take it very, very seriously, especially children's books. And then with books, I did translate Squawk of Spanish. That was my first translation of my own book, so that was surreal. It was so exciting. Yeah, with books, it's just not enough to translate literally, like just the words, because my goal is for every translation, for every Spanish reader, to have the same or as similar as an experience as possible as the readers of that source language. And a lot is involved in the experience, right? So the process actually, especially for some books, it's called transcreation. And it is the name that let's see, the marketing marketing translators. I don't know if that's the right term that they want to use, but people that translate slogans, they have to know so much about the culture, because it could be the same word in Spanish, it could be insulting the thing. So yeah, my favorite books to translate are actually picture books in rhyme, because some translators will just say, you can't do that. And I'm like, it's the best. It's just a beautiful puzzle, because you really are learning, you're reading, absorbing the story, and then you're saying the story in another language, but you have to make it rhyme, and it has to be telling this, it has to be working with the illustrations, right? So even if you read the whole story, you can't have the cat appearing 3 pages later just because it rhymes better there, because it has to go with the illustrations. So yeah, with books in prose, so like Squawk of Spanish, it still needs like a very fine read of the experience. So a few questions I ask myself is, okay, what about the title? Should it be translated literally? Does it work? Or should we come up with a new title that is as catchy as the English? Because sometimes those things are lost in translation. And the answer, of course, depends a lot. And it also depends, it's a conversation I cannot just have by myself. I have to have with the publisher, because it's different, for instance, if it's for readership, like if it's for the US market or for a market somewhere else.
Oh, because like even when you're translating in Spanish, you mean, like whether it's for Spanish speakers here versus Spanish speakers in Panama.
So or with Squawk Spanish, un Graznido en Español, I actually had like a whole brainstorm of different titles. And when I had that conversation with Charles Bridge, they explained to me that when if this was for the outside Spanish speaking market, like in Mexico or South America, they would definitely have that conversation. But for the US market, they have studied that the best is actually the closest or the most literal translation, because of the way people use these books. So a lot of librarians, a lot of teachers will use both books together, so that as close as possible is the best. So all these are conversations you're having. You're thinking about, do we translate a character name or not?
Right.
So those things, and usually the main character, you don't want to translate the name, because if the book goes huge and it's Harry Potter, you want the whole world to know Harry Potter. But sometimes the secondary characters, if you cannot pronounce the name, that can be an obstacle. So anyway, I can talk for a whole hour about translation, and I don't remember the original.
No, that's exactly what I was interested in, because that's so fascinating, especially that there would be a difference between the US market versus other places. Because what I was thinking of is, I know even just like, say, food names, or names of plants and things like that are so different in every country, that I wonder how you would even pick which one. Like, I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but one that's maybe called a different name in Mexico versus Argentina. What name do you choose when you're doing the translation? And I guess it depends on where you think where the market is. Is that how you do it? Okay.
And then of course, if it's a very cultural book, like there are books where it like really is an introduction to the Dominican culture, then hands down you want to use the cultural term that they use in the Dominican Republic. But if it's a broader book, like Squawk of Spanish, where yes, this bilingual boy, but it could be any culture, and that it's more, a term I don't like, but neutral Spanish, which basically is Spanish for the U.S. market. Like, what is the broadest term that the most amount of people will recognize, and that is also not like a bad word in another language? Because that happens too, even within the Spanish market. You're like, oh, we don't want to offend anyone. But it is. So it's a fun puzzle, and it's good to catch those things. And the more I translate, especially books, the more I learn. So yeah, I guess at the end of the day, my goal is really to serve the reader,
Mm,
especially in the US market, because I want that reader to be proud of that book. The worst that can happen is that they see the book and it sounds translated, because when it sounds
right.
translated, it's fine when something else sounds translated. Like if you receive information on
Like a flyer or a
like a flyer or something where you just want the information, but a story is an experience, and if it sounds
right,
translated, sometimes that feels a little like othered, like, oh,
right,
okay, I understand it, but this was not meant for me.
right.
And I also think a lot about the well, how should I put it, the prestige of language.
Mm,
You know, when a book is poorly translated, if all these books are poorly translated, I don't want them to become, oh, just Spanish books are not that good or
mm,
anything. I want this book to reflect the same experience. It's
right.
just I made it into a big deal, but it's a big deal
It
for
is.
me.
It is. No, I can definitely. Having looked for good children's books in Spanish, I know how many bad translations are out there. So it's so nice to have someone who's being so thoughtful and careful about it for all of the readers. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I want to give you a chance to talk about. So we've talked about these two books that you already have published, but I know I'm sure you have other projects coming up. I don't know how much you're able to share with us, but do you have any others that future projects that you can tell us about?
Yeah, I can. So with translation is a little trickier because I usually do the translation and then it's once the book is goes out to print, I'm not part of it. Um, but there is one translation. I'm working on a lot of translations, and I'm sure there's a lot of unannounced projects. There's one translation that I'm excited for because the author is so excited for the Spanish version, and
Mm.
she's been putting it on social media and things. So I think I can tell you. And it is a translation of Bitsy Bat, School Star by Cass Winnes. And so the Spanish version is Bitsy Murciélago, Estrella Escolar. And that's coming out in February 2025 by Simon and Schuster. And then as far as books in the works, I'm gonna go through a little bit of a publishing gap. I have two books in the works, but they come out 2027 and 2028.
Wow.
So yeah, patience. Yeah, they got pushed back, so I am working on them, but it's 2027 and 2028. Unannounced, but I can tell you a little bit about, especially the first one. They are both with Versify HarperCollins. And the first one is about a little girl, and she has many dreams, and they change with the changing of the seasons. But her main question is, how does a dream come true? And then, with the help of her grandfather, a cozy hammock, and a lot of paper and pencil, she just comes to discover how to work hard for each one of those dreams.
Man.
I'm excited about that one a lot, but I have to
Great.
wait. I'm I'm going out of submission soon, so we
But I
will.
think that's good for people. I think a lot of times people don't realize how much of a gap there can be in when books come out,
Yeah,
especially and sometimes that's out of your control, like if they
exactly.
get put back by the publisher. So it's a good
Yeah.
reminder.
Yeah, the this book that I'm talking about that's coming out in 2027, fingers crossed,
Mhm.
was supposed to come out in 2025. So
Wow.
it's just, yeah, it's a good reminder that you're you really need to love writing and the process, and then trust your books, and trust that when they come out,
It'll all be
they'll
worth
come out.
it.
It'll
Yeah.
be great.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. And it's just such a fascinating topic. I loved reading your book, so it was a real pleasure to get to speak with you.
Thank you so much. I loved being here, and this is my first IG live, so
Yay!
I hope I did a good job.
Yes, you did. This is perfect. This is great. And we're honored that you would do your first one with us. So we appreciate that.
Thank you so much. It's been great. I hope you have a great rest of your day.